Packing my things, I couldn't meet my parents' eyes. They stood silently in my hostel room, their expressions a mix of confusion and disappointment. My father's hands rested awkwardly on the handle of my suitcase, and my mother's fingers fidgeted with the edge of her scarf. They didn't understand why I was leaving the institute just 15 days after the commencement of offline classes. Truthfully, neither did I. All I knew was that I had to leave. The silence in the room was heavy, but inside me, a storm raged, a storm I could never share with anyone. It all began when the first wave of COVID-19 started to decline. Hostels were reopening, and students were called back for offline classes. I was both excited and anxious. The idea of finally sitting in a classroom after months of virtual learning thrilled me, but it was my first time leaving home. When my parents and I arrived to find me a hostel, we visited the first option on our list. It was terrible, cramped rooms with no windows and shared bathrooms that smelled like mildew. I rejected it immediately. The second hostel seemed better. It was a little farther from campus but had individual rooms with attached bathrooms. It felt like the right choice, quiet, secluded, a good place to study. Or so I thought. The first day passed uneventfully. I spent most of it unpacking and arranging my things. My room was at the far end of the second floor, the last door in a long corridor. I chose it intentionally, thinking the isolation would help me concentrate on my studies. The night was still and quiet, almost too quiet. Around 1 a.m., as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, the silence was broken by the faint sound of a voice. I froze, listening intently. The sound was coming from my laptop, which I'd left on the desk beside my bed. It was playing an audio lecture, our physics teacher's voice, droning on about electromagnetism. My heart raced as I scrambled out of bed. The screen was off, and the laptop was in sleep mode. How could it be playing anything? I switched it off completely and returned to bed, chalking it up to some weird glitch. But sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, I woke up groggy at 5:30 a.m. for the mandatory exercise session. As I stepped out of my room, I ran into the floor warden, a sweet middle-aged woman. She smiled at me and said, "Why were you studying the whole night? If you had to study, you could have used headphones." The sound was faint, but I could hear it during my rounds. "Studying?" I said, confused. "Ma'am, I wasn't studying. I was asleep." She frowned but didn't press further. I dismissed it as a misunderstanding and went about my day. That night, though, the same thing happened. Again, at 1 a.m., my laptop started playing an audio lecture on its own. This time, I was sure I'd shut it down properly. When I saw the screen light up and the audio begin, a chill ran down my spine. The warden was less forgiving this time. "If this happens again, I'll have to confiscate your laptop," she warned. I tried arguing, but her expression told me it was pointless. I'd have to figure out what was happening on my own. The next day, a senior from my hostel approached me after the exercise session. I recognized him as someone I'd seen around but never spoken to. He was tall, with a serious expression that made him look older than his years. "You're quite brave, aren't you?" he said abruptly. "What do you mean?" I asked, puzzled. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Don't you know? Do you have any idea what happened in your room?" "What?" He hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. 2 years ago, there was a student, my classmate. He committed suicide in that room. My blood ran cold. The boy continued, his voice barely above a whisper. He was depressed, but the final straw was when he was humiliated in front of our entire class by the physics teacher. That night, he ended it. I couldn't breathe. My mind flashed back to the audio lecture that had played on my laptop, my physics teacher's voice. I wanted to leave immediately, but finances were tight, and the warden refused to let me change rooms. The following nights were a waking nightmare. Every sound, a creak from the wardrobe, a knock on the wall, the faint rustle of fabric, felt amplified in the oppressive silence. Sleep became a distant memory. On the fifth night, something happened that I couldn't ignore. At 2 a.m., a loud bang echoed from the external bathroom beside my room. It was so loud that the warden came running, accusing me of causing the disturbance. I tried to explain that I hadn't left my room, but she wouldn't listen. Desperate, I turned to Faith. From that night onward, I started playing a soft prayer on my phone while I slept. For a few days, it worked. The nights were calm, and I began to think that maybe I'd found a solution. Until the 14th night. That night, I woke up abruptly. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The prayer I'd left playing on my phone had stopped. My heart pounded as I lay under the blanket, trying to convince myself it was just a dead battery. But then I heard it, a loud crash, like something heavy being thrown against the wall. I pulled the blanket off my head and froze. The room was lit, and my phone lay on the floor at the far edge of the room. It was on the opposite side from where I'd placed it before going to bed. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at the phone, too terrified to move. That was it. I couldn't stay another night. I ran to the warden's office and begged to use her phone. My parents answered on the second ring, their voices laced with concern as I pleaded for them to come get me. They didn't question my fear, perhaps they could hear it in my voice. They promised to arrive first thing in the morning. I spent the rest of the night sitting on a chair beside the warden's desk, my eyes fixed on the corridor that led to my room. Every creak, every whisper of movement, sent shivers down my spine. And now, here we were. My parents helped me pack in silence, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. They didn't ask why I was leaving, they only wanted me home. As I stepped out of the hostel for the last time, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I'd escaped the room, but the memories would stay with me forever, a haunting reminder of the abyss I'd stared into, and the abyss that had stared back.